Dear friends, let's give it another couple of minutes. Somebody might be moving through the rain. Right. And then we'll start.
Yeah, 5 more minutes. Очень тихо.
Все настраивается.
В году поверилось раскладывать.
Кого працює? Красиво. Четко. Крупнее?
Нет. Нет.
Маленькая штучка.
Спасибо.
Okay. All right. We're gonna begin softly. And good evening. Welcome to Globus Books. I'm glad to see familiar faces tonight, but for those who are joining us for the first time, welcome in. And thank you for your interest and support. I have a couple of short announcements before we begin. And first and foremost, please let's make sure our phones are silenced. And we're live streaming this event on our YouTube channel, Globus Books. The video is available for reviewing, for sharing. Please feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. This is how you can help us to spread the word about new and old talent that we discover here and important topics that we discuss within the Globus walls. For those who are watching us online, please feel free to submit a question. We'll be more than happy to answer them. For our audience, if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand. We will call you out. We will have a dedicated Q&A section after the main talk. So, as all of you, maybe some of you are aware, today marks the last day of January, the month that signifies a fresh start, a new beginning, high hopes, even though it's extremely hard to stay optimistic, witnessing all the unfortunate that is happening in our country, meaning the States and abroad. And it's also a month that we're honoring the memory of victims of the horrific catastrophes through the human history, such as the Holocaust. So tonight we'll be reading and discussing the Ukrainian poetry response to Babyn Yar events, the tragedy that is seemed to be impossible to put into words. Nevertheless, we're going to center on reading from Babyn Yar, Ukrainian Poets Respond, and Marianna Kiyanovska book, Voices of Babyn Yar. Please welcome our speakers for tonight, the Globus Book resident, our beloved friend, a poet, a writer, a translator, a scholar and researcher whose biggest subject is the siege of Leningrad, whose victims we're also remembering in January, Polina Barskova. And our longtime supporter and a friend, a talented translator and an editor who's probably roughly half of the books on the Ukrainian poetry translations we have here is done by this amazing human here, Ostap. Right, let's begin.
Good evening. Thank you for coming here through the rain and all that. So I really appreciate that you make an effort to come to hear about really difficult things, but weirdly enough, I think in connection with the most difficult things, there are also some important news and good news, and these news are books that are being born. This is Globus is one of my favorite places in San Francisco. And since I returned to Bay Area after some years elsewhere, I was really amazed by how much it changed in terms of its curating work, of how books are chosen here. And that there are so many books about the news, right? What is happening in the world today? What is happening in Russia? What is happening in Ukraine? What is happening in Belarus? And important books that make way to Balboa Avenue. And actually, I learn a lot when I come to Globus every time. And one of the most impressive things for me is to look at Globus's shelves of Ukrainian books. Today, as we all are very painfully aware, something we learn every morning when we open up the news. Ukraine is going through horrific historical moment again. But what I find to be so important that with it, in it, Ukraine is making extremely important work to remember. And this connection between the present and the past, I think, is crucial. And it will be one of the topics of what we're trying to create as the series of events dedicated to Ukrainian literature that will be happening here and at Berkeley, where I teach. So the idea is to bring important voices who will talk to us variously about what Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian society is trying to do today. I rushed here from Berkeley, where at the Pacific Film Archive they're showing movies by Sergei Loznitsa with him in residence, and it will be for the next 10 days. It's a rather unique situation to hear him speak about his movies, to say very difficult and controversial and important things with a very strong accent. Always makes one wonder. And today he was showing Babyn Yar in context. Laznitsa works with the Babyn Yar Memorial, has been working for some years, and this is how he created this documentary made of archival materials only. It's one of his montages. And of course, the striking thing there, for me, I just rewatched it, is that there is so much material around the event about the context, but absolutely, as we know, nothing of event. It's gone. It's one of those things of the 20th century that is just basically on some level non-documented. It's absent. And this is for me one of the most striking and upsetting things ever, when things disappear, when somebody makes things disappear. The first book that we'll be talking today about, this volume, Babyn Yar, Ukrainian Poets Respond, is the book of my absolutely favorite kind. It's an effort to find, to preserve, to bring to the reader things that were hiding for decades. It takes a lot of effort to silence things. And every state is very good at it. Russia is great. United States is amazing, as we're learning every day now. Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine also did a lot to silence what happened in 1941. And then somebody comes and says, I reject this. I reject silence. I reject disappearance. I will look into it. I will look into this void. This was the main impulse for me to talk to you tonight about this, to look at this book, to figure out how it happened. So, Ostap, let's talk. It's time for us to listen to your voice. Please join us.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia, for your kind introduction, for organizing and putting together this event, and for hosting it. So today I will talk, as Polina just mentioned, about Ukrainian poets who, starting from 1941 till the last poem in this book is from 2018, how they responded to the tragedy of Babyn Yar. And we will try to first talk what actually happened in Babyn Yar.
Right. When people ask you,
Yes.
what is the event? What happened there? What do you say?
So, just to few words. So, as we remember that on September 17, 1941, Soviet troops left the city. In 2 days, the Nazi Germany troops entered the city, and the city has been occupied until November of 1943 for a little more than 2 years. And shortly after the Nazi Germany troops arrived at the city, they posted this infamous trilingual announcement in Russian, Ukrainian, and also in German that local Kyiv Jews are supposed to meet on the intersection of 2 streets. They misspelled the name of one of the streets. So another question, who actually was preparing this announcement? And in the course of 2 days, during September 29th and September 30th, 1941, around 34,000 Kyiv Jews were killed in the ravine that was on the outskirts of the city. But that was not the end. The killings continue, and historians suggest that roughly between 100,000, 150,000 Jews from Kiev, but also from the area, as well as the representatives of other nationalities residing in the city, Ukrainians, Russians, several Romani camps, Soviet prisoners of war, sailors, detained soldiers, um, local communists, Ukrainian nationalists were executed on that site. So we now know Babyn Yar as probably one of the largest killing sites in the former Soviet Union and in present-day modern Ukraine. Following the end of the war, Soviet system ideology suppressed commemoration of the Holocaust and insisted on implementing what was seen as a sort of they framed it as a universal suffering of the Soviet people during the war. Police, not only police, were very careful in dispersing all kind of groups of activists who were trying to gather and to commemorate the event. So these unauthorized commemoration meetings were not possible. In 1946, a monument was erected in Babyn Yar, and it was there. You could have read that for 100,000 citizens of Kiev and prisoners of the war. So it had no reference to the Holocaust. The inscription there had no mention. And only in 1991, the monument commemorating Jews killed in Babyn Yar was built, and the place was characterized as a site of Jewish massacre. From early on, and as we can see in this by reading the books, reading this book, that from early on, poets, specifically poets, try to understand, respond, and represent this tragedy, in addition to all kinds of other artists or film directors that try to come up with representations of this tragedy.
What was the original impulse for you to put this book together? How the idea has come to you?
So there are two kind of like main things that caused me to work on this book. One was that I began working on an anthology of Ukrainian Jewish poets, and the idea of that anthology was that I am collecting Ukrainian Jewish poets, working in Ukrainian and writing about all kinds of Jewish themes, cultural, historical, political, social, etc., to understand how actually this tradition of Ukrainian Jewish writing was made and how it was developing, starting from the 19th century until nowadays. And as I was working on the book, I realized that one of the central topics for Ukrainian Jewish poets was the topic of the Holocaust. Moreover, within that main, or one of the main topics, which was Holocaust, the topic of Babyn Yar dominated. So at some point, I realized that actually it would be important to sort of like put a separate volume dedicated exclusively to writing about the Babyn Yar tragedy. But I also wanted to include into this book not only Ukrainian Jewish poets, but non-Jewish poets from Ukraine, as for them too, as we see from this book, it was a tragedy that preoccupied them and something that they responded to from early on. So that was sort of like one main motive, that reason that made me work on this. And there was the second one, that as someone who is thinking about and researching Ukrainian Jewish writing, I was surprised to see that like practically never, or very, I mean, at least the books I've consulted, I couldn't find any writing translated from Ukrainian about the Holocaust in, for example, American anthologies dedicated to the Holocaust, or something in the UK. So for me, it was another challenge. Was this overlooked by those who were trying to put this, when they were trying to put this writing together, or was it something that actually we don't have in Ukrainian literature? So basically, these were the two main central kind of like combination. So a combination of interest, but also with some sort of maybe some sort of disappointment or annoyance, bitter annoyance that this kind of writing is not present in English, that it is omitted from the larger scene. And I think it is in order to understand something as the Holocaust, and especially to compare the types of writing, what was produced in Western Europe, what was produced in Eastern Europe, and the more kinds, the more types of writing we have and available, kind of like the more larger or more productive our dialogue can be as we think about this. And so we ended up with my colleague, the poet John Hennessy, with whom we, by that time, translated one book of poems, collection called A New Orthography by Sergei Zhadan. So we decided to collaborate on what became our second book length project.
So now the logical question is, while you were finding this allegedly non-existent or hiding or disappeared voices, what were the biggest surprises? And also, where did you find them? And who became somebody important for you, the most important?
Yeah. So one thing that I should mention is that this is the first anthology of Ukrainian language writing about the Holocaust. So in Ukraine, we had anthologies about Babyn Yar, prepared and published earlier, but in the past they would usually contain writings in Ukrainian, writings in Russian by um, Ukrainian Russophone poets, but also by Russian poets, as well as translations mainly into Russian from Yiddish. So sort of like we had this trilingual map of so actually, and it was another reason probably to some extent that for me, in order to have a more clear vision, a map of this Ukrainian language writing, I was intrigued and sort of motivated to keep on and working on this. It was a challenge because, for example, there were different periods in the Soviet history about which we can possibly talk about, in which there were some sort of like possibilities, some rooms in which poetry about the Holocaust could have been written, but more importantly, could have been published. But in some cases, we have poets in this book whose poetry, let's say, appeared in 1942, but it was never reprinted later after the poet's life. So that was something that was sort of important for a poet to say, but on the other hand, it was impossible to continue to return to.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these kind of like scattered voices of poets in these newspapers or some magazines or some debut collections in which that poem appeared, and you would need to go there and to locate them and to put them together. One of the most striking, the majority of these poems, they have their own special, unique history of how they were written, but also how they were published, and sometimes how they were forgotten and how they were sort of revived. And one of the most astonishing stories is from actually 1941. It is a poem by this young Jewish poet, Yaakov Halperin, who, due to his health issues, problems, could not join the Red Army. And he also didn't want to leave the city. He, as some of his friends later recalled, he said that if I want to see how Germans enter the city. And he remained in the city. His Ukrainian friends helped him to get forged Ukrainian identification. So, but not only he had this fake ID, he was also contributing to Ukrainian language newspapers, which were established shortly after the Nazi Germany occupied Kiev, which is like a fascinating story. So, and he has several poems which were published in these Nazi-controlled newspapers using this in which sort of course, he is unable to say directly what was going on, but if we sort of read and decipher line by line, we can understand that in fact what he saw just a month before prompted him to come up with his response. There were some other situation that I would say that that there are, let's say, three phases when these poems were written. First is the period from the beginning of the war and until approximately 1946, 1947, when it is still possible to publish work. And we do have a certain number of poems that ended up in print, as I mentioned. Some of them, actually the majority of them, were not reprinted later on, but we had them. And then, of course, in the late 40s, the state-orchestrated anti-Semitic campaigns begin, and it is impossible to publish anything on Jewish topics until the period of thaw. And the 60s is also the period that coincides with this new cultural, literary movement, historical movement of so-called шестидесятники, the generation of the 60s, who is this new generation of writers who are coming up with their new ways of writing, which we can probably call some sort of like second way of Ukrainian Soviet modernism. The first one was in the 1920s and the 1930s, and they are very much nurtured by this tradition of the 20s and the 30s, but they also offer new. So this is another. This is the 60s is the period when kind of like a new chapter of this Holocaust writing in Ukrainian begins, and it lasts approximately until the Perestroika period, until the mid-1980s, and then we have the period from the late 1980s and roughly till nowadays, when poets are freed of ideological, stylistical, formal, sort of like restraints, and actually are coming up with yet another way of talking about the Holocaust and talking about the Babyn Yar tragedy. And actually, Marianna Kiyanovska is one of these poets who included also in this anthology, that is one of the latest poets who is in the book.
Would you like to read for us some of the works, some of the texts that are most important for us, for you?
Okay.
Starting maybe with Helperion.
I think I will read in Ukrainian, but also I will read in English. I was thinking of starting with a poet from the 60s, Leonid Cherevatenko, who is one of шестидесятники, who is based in Kyiv, and he's writing his poem in 1966, and 1966 is important for many reasons, because this is the 25th commemoration of the tragedy, and some important um, gatherings took place in Babyn Yar that year, as well as we also have a few poems from that period. So this one is called Michelangelo. I will read first in Ukrainian and then I will read in English. Ось аматорське фото із архівів фашизму. Глинистою лощовиною тече повільна ріка блідих переплетених тіл. Пекельне видиво Мікеланджело. Голі женщини, голі діти, голі каліки й діди. Всіх їх забито в потилицю. А поміж них мужчини намитні валуни серед поля, голі горбасті руки свої, поміж калік та дітей хоронять, і схоронити не можуть. Роздягнені догола мужчини, їх так само забито в потилицю. Ненавидне видиво Мікеланджело. Michelangelo. Here is amateur photo from the archives of fascism. Through a rotten ravine flows a slow river of pallid intertwined bodies, a hateful scene from Michelangelo. Naked women, naked children, naked disabled, and old men. They all are shot in the neck. And among them men like boulders in the middle of the field. Their naked, gnarled hands among the disabled and children. They bury and can't bury men totally naked, who were also shot in the neck. A hateful scene from Michelangelo. So, as I mentioned, this was from the mid-60s, and I will now read a poem by Boris Davo Nikolaev. He wrote this poem in early 2001. It's called Випробування трагедії. Шлях, 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 шелех, шелест, шерех, підошв з Галицької площі на захід до сонця. Антрацит, наче, уяр, бабин, шлях, шелех, шелест, шерех, шерех, шерех. Київ, мов чав, чав, чав. А чи чув, чув, чув. Tested by tragedy. Street, street, street. Swish, shush, swoosh of shoe bottoms from Halitska Square westward to the sun, like anthracite, to Babyn Yar. Street, swish, shush, swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Kyiv was silent, but did it listen, listen, listen? Should I read on?
Yeah.
All right. So I will probably read one more poem. This is by Marianna Kiyanovska, about whom we are going to talk very soon. It is from her 2017 collection called in Ukrainian Babyn Yar Голосами, Babyn Yar Voices. And what she does is she has this stylistically, this is probably the most sort of built on various modernist writing, built on various various modernist tradition. In her poetry, she does not use any punctuation mark. She does not use any capital letters. She does not use any titles for her poems. In the table of content, you have only the title of the collection, and we can basically read it whether as a novel in verse or a poema, a long epic or narrative poem. And so we have this collection of voices by her, and this is one of them. I will read first again in Ukrainian, then in English. Я би вмерла на вулиці, цій або тій, що за рогом, та конвой не дозволить. Здається, проси, не проси. У валізі не те, щоби речі збирались в дорогу, як збираються люди в дорогу в останні часи. Тільки ключ і листи, фотографії, брошка і гроші. Ну, не те, щоби гроші, всього лише кілька банкнот. Ми бредемо по куряві літній, немов по пороші, оминаючи вирви тіла і сліди нечистот. Увірвалися в дім, наказали все цінне узяти. Я взяла теплий плед, трохи хліба і трохи води. А есесівець кривився віспало на вбогість кімнат, що запалась раптом ніщо, як і я, назавжди. А тепер я іду назавжди, розумію і бачу суперечність нашу крізь світла щільного ясу. Я би вмерла на вулиці цій, і тому я не плачу, а валізу на брук опускаю, ім'я лиш несу. Я Рахиля. This one was from Babyn Yar, the voices of Babyn Yar. I would die on this street or on the one around the corner, but the convoy won't let me. It seems whether you beg or not. Unusual things in my suitcase. I've packed the way people pack for the road these days. Only the key, letters, photographs, a brooch, and money. All right, not exactly money, just a few bills. We wandered through the summer dust as through first snow, bypassing the craters, bodies, the traces of sewage. They burst into the house and ordered us to take all valuables. I took a warm blanket, some bread, and some water, and a SS soldier grimaced at the poverty of our room, which suddenly fell into nothing, like me into forever. And now I'm leaving for good. I understand and see all our doom through the glitter of intense lights. I would die on this street, and so I don't cry. But I settle my suitcase on cobblestones. I carry only my name. I am Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I wanted to kind of open the story of Ostap's book with the story of the book by this very poet whom you just heard, Marianna. Because for me, these books are in dialogue. Something has happened in the past and it's making sense today. And I guess in general, it's one of the questions that interests me the most. What happens with history? What happens in history of what Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlands? And what happens to history that seems at this point to happen on a loop, right? Marianna Kiyanovska, and this is the book. It's Ukrainian and English, and I wrote the introduction. This is, for now, the role I played in this, but also I'm translating Kiyanovska into Russian, and I will read you a couple of texts that, again, mild lingual situation would happen and resound. Though I think another thing that should happen, Kiyanovska is already translated into German and is being translated into Hebrew. So what is amazing that when asked what made Kiyanovska? This is one of my favorite questions. I ask people, what made you to create this book? How did you conceive of this book? No, we work on books for years. It's a very long pregnancy usually. And you are never sure what the reception will be. Books have their fates, as we know. But one never can be too sure. You just go and do it. You write it or you collect it. And her answer is extremely important and paradoxical. Kiyanovska says that she began writing this book because of the war that is happening today. Basically, her response was to go back into the past, which I think is very important somehow, to begin again to look at the 20th century and its dramatic continuation, trying to connect torn moments of history, which is something that absolutely fascinates me also. While most of the poems in the collection that Ostap put together, one of the most difficult situations when you talk about disaster that happened years ago, how do you define your position? Of whose persona do you speak? And it's extremely complicated. So what Kiyanovska does, and what you already heard, I am Rahil, and what you will hear again in the moment, is very controversial. Again, very often when we speak about books, movies, operas, vocal cycles, whatever, about the disastrous events, there is this word controversial, because the task is to bring back history, to bring back the dead. And there is something very offensive about this task, right? When I heard Ostap's story that there is a Jewish poet in Kiev who is publishing in the Nazi press, I was just, what the hell? What is it that I don't know about history? And Kiyanovska, in a way, offended everybody because she began writing from the first person. And the whole problem of cultural, historical appropriation is very much hers. But she is asked about it all the time. And her answer is that just in order to make us, her readers, her listeners, she's an amazing reader, as we know, to make us feel something, it has to be a very direct utterance. In a way, it has to be very direct address, and this is her job. This is her position. She speaks about what happened, yes, in the fall of 1941, but this is a book. It has almost 100 poems, but she claims there were many hundreds. And then she produced the operation of selection, and it's everybody. It's Jews who are in Babyn Yar, people who are shooting the Jews. It's Kiev, the city of Kiev, one of my favorite poems, I will read it to you, that is watching. Every possible position, every possible participant. And this is also so curious to observe what are the positions chosen by the poets in Ostap's collection, that people are learning to speak about this. So what else is important about Kiyanovska? It's multilingual. She includes German. She includes moment of Yiddish sometimes. She's trying, but obviously she's writing in Ukrainian. And again, the task of this work is to return the tragedy, to return the event to the realm of Ukrainian language. It happened in Kiev, and somehow that this version is also present now. I think it's very, very important. Marianna herself, she remarkably, we just hosted her at Berkeley this fall. She answers these questions about historical memory and responsibility remarkably bravely, I think. That yes, it is, as you're experiencing now, difficult, unpleasant, strange to look back, to look at the shadows, but also there is some kind of joy that I do understand that for a moment of the poem, these people again exist. Because as I said, and this is how I was uh, coming here through rain, in a situation and a feeling of total absence, when Lasnitsa said that absolutely nothing remained. There is this poignancy of absolutely nothing, and how these voices are trying um, to bring life, even if for a small moment. So let's listen to poetry for a couple of more minutes, couple of more moments, and see how this poetry lives differently in different languages. Because obviously both books, they're bilingual, which is a huge deal for me. And usually when there is such an option, I insist, and I talk about this to my friends all the time, that books of poetry ideally could and should be bilingual when they're in translation. That even if you don't understand language, if you don't understand Ukrainian, if you don't understand Russian, there is possibility for the original to touch you, to be present in some way. Uh, so if you read this, Roland,
So again, this has no title.
pogrom.
Терор вже був, а як зоветься це? Прийти з речами, я не сплю ночами, змінилися і руки, і лице. Не можу заспокоїтись, хоча ми удома всі тривожились. Та я, у мене розлад мови, розпад світу. У мене шлунка біль і печія. Боюся відчувати, розуміти, не можу заспокоїтись. Чому смерть це, коли вбивають? І раптово. Тамую крик, вдивляюся в пітьму, не маю слів, це як параліч мови, знечулення, не біль, а щось за ним. Було у книгах, вже не пам'ятаю, стояла попільничка, синій дим. Сашуня вже не спить із нами з краю. Її там розстріляв якийсь солдат. Сусідка наша бачила при брамі. Сашуня відхилилася назад. Тихенько впала, не сказала мамі. Тож ми йдемо. Маргарита, ми казали взяти золото. Усюди, говорю Маргариті, обійми Сашуню на прощання. Нас не буде.
I will read now this poem in English translation of Oksana Maximchuk and Max Sachensky, and then in my translation. And I will speak about the issue of translation a little bit, but I think it will be somewhat obvious. There was terror yet, but what to call all this? Assembled there by 9, I do not sleep the nights. My hands and face have been transformed, cannot come down. cannot go on, although we're all now worried sick at home, but my very language fails, world falls apart. I have a heartburn and a stomachache. I am afraid to sense, to understand. I simply cannot comprehend it. Why? That's when they kill a sudden change. I look into the darkness, stifling a cry. No words in me. Paralysis of language. Benumbing but not pain. Beyond the pain, I must have read it somewhere, I forget. A bluish curl of smoke over an ashtray. No more Sashunya on the edge of bed. Some soldier shot her, so the neighbor said. She caught a glimpse of it over the wall. Sashunya standing still, then leaning back and falling quietly to Mama, not a word, so we are going. Margaret and us. The posters call to bring along the gold. I say to Margaret, embrace Sashunya, say your goodbye, for we will be no more. So while English version obviously is working to the language of the Holocaust memory, and it is rather straightforward that this text is connected to Tselan, with the Margaret at its center and the Todesfuge. And again, Ostap spoke about the role of modernism, modernist writing in all this. While I had various questions and problems and struggle translating this into Russian, but the author agreed, Marianna agreed, so I decided this also should exist in Russian. But Russian gives us another opportunity to preserve amazing rhyme work that Kiyanovska does. And as Ostap said, and as you will see in the book when you look at the text, actually, indeed, she rejects punctuation, traditional punctuation. It's as if, to some extent, there is a flow visually, but the sound is astute and aggressive. And yet, the sound is everywhere. It's a totally sonorous, beautiful sound writing that speaks about absolutely abhorrent things. And I think this conflict that we're talking about, beautiful poetry, that speaks about the ugliest thing possible. And there is something kind of this almost nauseating feeling that is created by this conflict. And this is what I attempted to preserve. Террор уж был, а это как назвать? Прийти с вещами я не сплю ночами. Лицо и руки не могу узнать. Мне не покой, в меня глядит, хотя мы. Все дома растревожились, и я. Со мной разлад слов, распад света. В желудке рейси жжется желчь моя. Боюсь познать, понять, помыслить это. Я не могу покой найти. Не мой. Смерть — это вид убийства. И нежданно. Захлебываюсь воплем, пялюсь тьмой. В параличе язык и в каждом слове рана. Не ощущаю боль, но что за ней? Там было в книгах, только я не помню. Там пепельница, дым, сирей, синей. Сашуни с нами ни в одной из комнат. Ее там расстрелял один солдат, соседка наша видела у двери. Сашуня тихо пятилась назад, упала, пала, мама, нет, не верит. А мы идем. Мы, Маргарита, мы. Сказали, золото сюда нести с собою. Сказала Маргарите, обними Сашуню на прощание с собою. And another text, which may be one of my favorite. Again, the question of the city and the question of what remains. The city is there. It's suffering again. The amazing city of Kiev. It is there. One can visit. And the very question, right? Lasnitsa said today. So that this there were several attempts to build a memorial. And now the third one is halted because of the Russia's war against Ukraine. And there is something absolutely poignant about this, right? That it's so difficult to build a memorial that would really express what happened. And while these things seem to be so difficult for all kinds of exciting and disgusting reasons, poetry happens because you need basically a pencil and a piece of paper, computer. And for me, this poem about the city watching the tragedy and us connecting with the city is very important in this way.
Sorry to interrupt. This is a crazy detail. So is there like an active opposition to a memorial? Was there an active opposition before the war?
Yeah, yes. The answer is yes. I will begin speaking about this, and maybe Ostap will continue. And the topic of the Soviet active opposition to the Holocaust memory is basically crucial for both books. And again, something I thought about today that as a result, the Soviet relationship with the Jewish disaster of the 20th century turned out to be not much more humane than the Nazi one. And we know about the tragedy of the 1940s, the end of the 1940s, when all the Yiddish poets were murdered in Moscow in one night, the disaster of the Jewish committee, right? So, starting from then, basically, Jewishness was erased. Grossman says from 1943, but one way or another, this is a very disputable topic. There was no memorial for the Jews of Babyn Yar. And there are all kinds of stories about it. One of the stories that I find to be, I don't know, important, endearing, one of my favorite Soviet writers, Viktor Nekrasov, who wrote В окопах Stalingrada, who absolutely was not a Jew, but was very much a citizen of Kiev and loved Kiev, and then was forced out of it. He was one of the people who at different points attempted to fight for the monument being there and failed. And then this is why they asked him to leave. There is a huge story about the last attempt before the war that is going on now, in which, by the way, Lasnitsa also participated to build the memorial. And now again, not much is happening because when the city is being bombed, maybe it's not the best time to build memorials. This is a very long answer to your question. Yes, there was opposition for, yeah.
One thing to add, the last attempt to build a memorial was supposed to be financed by one of Russian big Jewish oligarch, and when that is also one of the reasons why it stopped. Yeah, because since he himself is associated with Russia, nobody wanted to proceed as well.
Right.
I don't remember the names of the
It seems the task of building the adequate memorial for Babyn Yar is somehow, but there are many small, tiny plaques on that
and
place.
installations
And-
and installation periods.
And by the way, one of the people who writes about it remarkably is my personal, extremely controversial writer, Jonathan Littell, the author of the amazing book about Babyn Yar, The Kindly Ones. In English, it was written in French. And his recent book, which I bought here, because I buy my books in Globus, это не реклама, это признание какого-то рода счастья. Littell just wrote a book, and it's translated into Russian, that connects his relationship to Babyn Yar and his relationship to Bucha, where he went there with an important French photographer, and he makes pictures of what is there, again, dreaming and regretting the situation that the memorial. Again, Laznica today spoke about the memorial that would be the place of study and memory, which I think is also very important. Should I read?
There is a simple, pragmatic American solution. It's like, oh, well, there is aid. You just put a paragraph in the aid package.
Simple American solutions do not always work.
Well, no, the simple ones usually work, but that hasn't happened yet, right?
Not yet.
Yeah. Meaning nobody has advocated for such a thing.
Right.
Such a simple thing.
Such a simple thing. And also, at the moment, it's frozen because, as I said many times, it's war.
Yeah.
To build a monument when things and the most important historical buildings are being bombed day after day might be rather problematic. But yes, we do hope. And yes, I will utter it. And yet, I will accept it all by saying, not saying, like walking into the sea. War means an obscurity, a terrible dark of woe. It means a despair, a naked and piercing grief. I saw the Dnipro last night, didn't make it to the Dnipro. I watched from the distance its waters, its rolling waves, the yellowing leaves aflame, and the ancient boats picked with decaying planks from under the surface. White seagulls were searching in vain for a witness to their unavian cries, mourning the dying town. I cried out non-humanly, stopped myself, bit my tongue, and now I will utter it. Presence is always twofold. We are center-drilled beads. A bullet goes in and out, not one set apart. We are all of us strung together. Sun reaches its zenith as if it has risen up to witness us from above, and how we are dying here, how we are meandering, watching the river flow, because we get slaughtered. Adelka, Miriam, Deborah, all lie in the ravine. I bear such a great woe. It turns heart to stone and makes the soul turn transparent. It grows even thinner, and that means no less than death. Its being is twofold, for death really means together with Deborah, Adelka, and Miriam, as far as celestial depth, as far as the Dnipro's flow in the timeless ether. Я все же это промолвлю, я все же это приму, я все же произнесу это или нет. Войду словно в море. Война означает незнание и страшную горе тьму. Война означает отчаяние и голые сгустки горя. Вчера на Днепре была я, но все же не на Днепре. Издалека смотрела на воды его, на волны, на красные вспышки листьев, на старые его лодки, гниющие под водой, и на белых чаек. Пыталась быть свидетелем для первых нептичьих криков скорбящих рыбаков. Плакала глубоко, нечеловечески. И все же я это промолвлю. Присутствие всегда обоюдоостро. Все мы бусины с отверстием посередине. Кто с пулей внутри, кто с пулей на вылет. Все мы бусины. Никто из нас не сам по себе. И солнце стоит высоко, как будто оно забралось посмотреть на гибель города. Что с ними, что с нами, что с ними сталось? Как мы блуждаем по городу, как на реку смотрим мы, как мы здесь лежим убитые, Адель, Мириам, Дебора, как мы здесь лежим во рву сердцами полными тьмы, сердцами подобными камню, с душой прозрачной, как горе, становящейся тоньше, площе. Это и значит смерть, природа которой двойная, природа которой со всеми, с Деборой, Аделью и Мирием, покуда небо есть твердь, покуда есть Днепр и утесы, и длятся дольше, чем время. So we thought that maybe it's time for your questions and curiosities about this very topic, the possibility of this becoming words, becoming literature. I will ask with asking Ostap. Is anybody that you know of the younger generation, younger Ukrainian poets writing about Holocaust today?
Yeah, actually, so for this anthology, which I mentioned in the very beginning, an anthology of Ukrainian Jewish poets, you see this, as I mentioned, that the topic of the Holocaust was something that permeated, was extremely significant for poets who started writing about it from the 40s, and they continue today too. And it's fascinating to actually look at this collection, which is not published yet, and see how, even though their tradition, their building is being constantly interrupted, is being constantly stopped, is being, the Soviet period, sort of like adjusted, you still have this tradition being built. And it is additionally more fascinating to see how this new chapter of Ukrainian Holocaust writing that begins from approximately the end of 1980s, and with the years it becomes more and more important for both those who write poetry, but also for those who write prose, how it sort of develops and what kind of like themes are being discussed, presented, but also from a literary point of view, how it is being done.
What is the difference between how Holocaust was written about in Soviet Union and in immigration?
Great question. So sometime during when I was talking about the book, I mentioned that there were three sort of like periods. There's the period of the 40s, then from 60s till the end of the 80s, and then from the end of the 80s till nowadays, basically. But I skipped one important part, that we had this Soviet context and we had this post-Soviet context. But in fact, we also had a another terrain, another location when writing was allowed. And fascinating that actually these were Ukrainian poets who were not Jewish, who wrote about the Holocaust, and they were, at least the poems which are collected in this book, I'm not talking about because they are strictly related to Babyn Yar. So the poems which are here, the majority of them are written in the 70s, which is kind of like also shows that this is also a period when Holocaust becomes really important in American writing and in American media. So kind of like the poets, it becomes significant for poets in exile, in immigration as well, and something they start thinking about. And one of the poets included in this book, her name is Tarnavska, and she was actually from Galicia, what is the present day Western Ukraine, but she fled with her parents as a teenager. And her poem actually, it's called, I don't remember the exact, let me, in my life too, there was a Babyn Yar, and her poem is actually based on her childhood memories of how the Holocaust was happening in the territory of what is present day Western Ukraine. So she kind of like built this sophisticated line which connects the sort of like central part of Ukraine with what was the western part of Ukraine.
Any other questions about this history, this literature?
Can I ask? When we talk about the attitude from the rest of the city, the rest of the country, the rest of the republic, Babyn Yar, I immediately think about Poland. And my question to you, did you see anything? What do they? Well, I know what they're doing now, but I don't know what they do in poetry. Is there any poetry written on what happened in Poland? Because for me, the things are very similar. It's a question of scale, but the rest is very similar.
I mean, it's a very big and complex question,
Sorry.
and I cannot provide some.
But you can give some examples.
But I mean, Milosz is one of the examples. Milosz who remained in Warsaw, Czesław Milosz, who was not Jewish, and he has one of his most famous poems is from I think 1944, which is called, I don't remember exactly, but something like a poor Christian is looking at the ghetto. So, but in Poland, it's you have lots of responses in Polish and also in Yiddish, written during the war. And also it was a topic that was in post-World War II period. I think that there is, and poets like Adam Zagajewski, who is, for example, original, who also dedicated a lot of his poems to the topic of the Holocaust. So, like very briefly, but I know that this is one of the themes that is important for contemporary Polish English.
If we are speaking about adjacent countries, how about Lithuania? Is there any response in Lithuania? Part of my family perished in the ghetto of Kaunas, but I never heard about any poems of Lithuanian authors.
I just don't. I'm not sure I can answer this question about this.
a slightly different question. So, you know, the anthology, as you explained, collects poems from different periods and correspondingly some in different styles. But if you were to adjust for that, do you think there is a difference in the poetic language and poetic methods that people use to write about Babyn Yar versus what they use kind of to write about other topics?
Yeah, great question, and it's another kind of complex because this work not this book. It does not only collect the poems about Babyn Yar, but it also creates like some sort of a platform for and some sort of a lab in which you can look at these poems, read them slowly, decipher, and you actually notice that the poems are written, and I'm generalizing here, but in the style of basically the then time. So if we have a poem by Pavlo Tychina, another kind of like vital modernist poet uh, of Ukrainian literature of the 20th century, modernist who switched to socialist realism, but it is written according to sort of the norms or kind of like practices which were common for that time. What is different, what happens differently is in immigration. They seem to be more open to experiment, as they were not subjects of those constraints. And of course, after starting from 1980s, you observe these multiple approaches. And I hoped I wanted to show Dabo Nikolaev, who wrote his poem in the beginning of the 20th century and who was a poet of older generation. And I wanted to show you how Marianna Kiyanovska writes only just several years ago. Also, these are two sort of different types of modernist writing performed by poets of different generations and like whose writing was cultivated their writing through different kind of like epochs and approaches to poetry writing, but also Leonid Cherevatenko, who this moment of novelty and a moment of experiment, a moment of kind of like sort of carte blanche that the period of the 60s received, and kind of like these are, or at least in my opinion, kind of like three types of writings which could have been we have.
So you mentioned that some of these poems, they might have been published once and then they didn't get republished, which makes me think, and this might be a bigger question to how somebody goes about putting together an anthology. Like, how did you come across these poems? What, if you could speak to your process of finding these poems?
Yeah, indeed. So, for example, this we have here three poets, kind of some extent giants of Ukrainian 20th century: Pavlo Tychina, Maxim Rylsky, Volodymyr Susura. So those who were fortunate to survive the Stalinist purges during the wartime, they end up in evacuation. So and over there they read their poems and they publish those poems in the local newspaper. And then those poems are not reprinted until the 80s, when the poems are gone and it's in their like collected volumes published after their death. So I mean, it's basically it's an archaeological sort of like voyage trip, and why I appreciated that, of course, you're going through layers and layers and layers of writing, but you also see how this epoch functions, how one decade in literature, in print, in reception functions, and how those decades differ. So this is a lengthy process, but it also challenging process, but it is a rewarding experience as well. And also, yeah, please go ahead.
I'm so sorry, I didn't know what to interrupt. So all this stuff is very difficult to read, and probably it's more difficult to translate.
Mm-hmm.
Because all these poems are emotionally charged. It's very difficult to even touch those topics. Has it ever happened to you that you wanted to resist the temptation to translate these poems? Oh no, I'm not going to translate that because it's very difficult. Did it happen to you?
That I did not want to translate?
Or even refuse the idea to translate some poem because it was too difficult for emotional?
I mean, I see it as my job, and I'm like in this situation. What is left is just to work. So, and I think that if it was written, it is painful. It's probably also it should be heard as well in English, despite the circumstances of this poem, despite the content of this poem, because if it makes me uncomfortable, it means that it touched me and I feel something. And this is one of the great feelings, that you can feel something. So, and for me, it is like one of the most fundamental things of poetry or of literature in general. Like, how do we deal with emotions, how we present those emotions, and how we can convert those emotions if we can.
I actually think it's a great question because one of the parts of this work, with the difficult historical material, is that very often, in a way, you do resist and you do become tired. But also, then you return to it and you think that и все-таки я промолвлю, and nevertheless I will say this in a maybe rather predictable move of psychoanalysis. To say something gives you not pleasure but some kind of sensation, liberation maybe, which is better than silence on some level, than this never-ending anxiety of silence. And for me, this was experience of talking to Kiyanovska, listening to her poetry, reading her poetry, translating her poetry. It's this strange kind of flow of history going on. In 2 weeks, hopefully, we'll have here two more authors, Vasil Lazinsky and Ainsley Morse, an American translator who works with the Ukrainian and Russian and Russophone poet Masha Galina, who is in Odessa today, and whose poetry suddenly last several weeks is in every big American newspaper. And the same questions to the people who are trying to speak today about what is happening. That we have this rather obvious, if you wish, conflict between total difficulty of this material, putting it mildly, and strange, yes, as I said, freedom, strange power that it gives you, that you just don't allow anybody who is in power at the moment to write their narratives. Like we can try to variously to create words, because I think what you see today is a laboratory. I like this term that Ostap offered. There are so many ways to work with this stuff. Like, for example, reading old newspapers. The work of the rat is very important, the archival rat. And in addition to the work that poets do, right, then there is the team of the historians, the team of the translators, and crucially, the team of the readers, which I always stress, because half of the effort is to be able to receive this material. One of the stories that really, really impressed me before what is happening today in Ukraine began happening, I was peacefully digging my Siege of Leningrad material, also to everybody's trouble. And at some point in Petersburg, I met a woman who came to me, bought a book, one of the books here, asked for an autograph, and then said, "But I won't read it. It's too upsetting." And I really, really enjoyed the moment of total brutal honesty. And I thought, okay, I respect that. I respect the fact that you'll have this book at home. But when I do see people who open the books, I think this is a really brave and important work in a way. In order to, when I think about these poets whom Ostap finds in God-forgotten places, these poets didn't have pleasure and luxury to have their readers. And for me, this is one of the strangest things about literature, that for a love act to happen, a writer needs a reader, a poet needs a listener, and so on. And that these poems come again back to life, come again back to the readers. There is something endlessly sad and enchanting about this.
Yeah, well, I don't have a question, but I was thinking maybe I can conclude the official part of
Absolutely.
the evening with a little bit of a comment. And I see that a lot of those books are inspired and encouraged by Polina. There's always a preface, a little thank you by the translators and authors for all the support. And of course, as I said previously, half of the books here, translation is on the Ukrainian poetry, is done by Ostap, and this is all like prize-winning books. And it is. You can read it in his bio. But I just want to say thank you for bringing to us, the reader, something, little pieces, which is almost do not exist nowadays or forgotten. In the face when Ukraine is bleeding with its new wounds like Bucha, there's still a space and a place for books about Babyn Yar. And I really want to thank you, everybody who is involved in creating those books and preserving the history.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, people in this room whose first language and first culture is American. And it's remarkable that the small room is so international. because I think this is the way now. This weird connection, contamination of languages that also is connected to the notion of immigration, which I think is very important. And very often, as we see, this is where certain kind of culture happens, and this is something I've been thinking recently a lot about, that we ask ourselves every day, what can we do? We can read. It's not nothing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we can browse a little bit and eat amazing cookies and look at books. Please. Cookies and books.